The land office clerk kept glancing nervously at the door as he slid the deed across the counter. Silas Ward stared at the price. $50 for 1,000 acres that should have been worth thousands. In 6 months, not a single buyer had shown interest, despite multiple newspaper advertisements. Scout, his German shepherd, paced restlessly by the window, whining at something only he could sense. Even the dog seemed to understand what made no sense. Why would prime grazing land with working buildings sit practically abandoned? "You certain about this purchase, mister?" the clerk asked, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning. "That property, well, there's been some troubling incidents out there." Silas examined the paperwork carefully. Everything appeared legitimate, but tiny pencil marks in the margins caught his attention, numbers that looked like survey coordinates. Someone had been studying this land very carefully. What kind of incidents? The clerk leaned closer and whispered. The previous owner, Magnus Thornfield, vanished 3 years ago, left behind everything: livestock, belongings, even his supper half-eaten on the table. Some say he found something valuable out there. Others say that's what got him killed. As Silas signed his name, the clerk continued nervously. "Truth is, I've had orders to sell this property quickly, no matter the price. My boss says it's been sitting empty too long, costing the territory money in unpaid taxes." "Who's your boss?" "Territorial Land Commissioner. But between you and me, I think someone's been pressuring him to move this property fast. Someone who wants to see what a new owner might discover." Scout's ears perked up as a shadow passed by the window. Through the glass, Silas saw a well-dressed man watching from across the street. When their eyes met, the stranger didn't look away. Instead, he smiled and touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Who is that?" Silas asked. "Orville Banks. He's been asking about this property for months, but never made an offer himself. Strange thing is, every time someone showed interest before you, Banks would visit them privately. Next day, they'd change their minds about buying. But not me?" The clerk shrugged uncomfortably. "Maybe he thinks you're different. Maybe he thinks you'll succeed where Magnus failed." As Silas folded the deed into his jacket, those pencil-marked coordinates seemed to burn against his chest. Whatever Magnus Thornfield had been searching for, Silas had just inherited both the opportunity and the danger of finding it. And somewhere across the street, Orville Banks was watching with the satisfied expression of a man whose plan was finally in motion. The wagon wheels creaked as Silas guided his horse toward what was now his property. Scout trotted alongside, nose to the ground, following scents that seemed to make him increasingly agitated. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, but something felt wrong about the silence. Where were the cattle? Where were the other ranchers? For miles around, he'd seen nothing but empty land and abandoned homesteads. The ranch house came into view first, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch that should have been worth thousands. The barn stood solid and intact. The corral fencing looked recently repaired, yet everything sat empty, as if the previous owner had simply vanished mid-chore. Silas dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. The front door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Scout whined and refused to approach the house, instead circling the yard with his hackles raised. "What's got you spooked, boy?" Inside, the house was fully furnished. Dishes still sat on the kitchen table. A half-finished meal lay covered in dust. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the rooms, clothes in the wardrobe, books on the shelves, even a pocket watch on the nightstand. It was as if someone had been eating dinner and simply left. Silas picked up a letter from the desk, dated 3 years ago. It was addressed to someone named Magnus Thornfield, the previous owner. The letter was from a mining company, offering to purchase mineral rights for an substantial sum. The response was written in angry red ink across the bottom. "Never. This land stays in my family." Scout's barking from outside interrupted his reading. Through the window, Silas saw his dog circling something near the barn. When he went to investigate, he found Scout pawing at a patch of disturbed earth. The ground had been dug up and refilled, but not recently. Grass had grown over it, though the soil still looked different from the surrounding area. A wooden stake protruded from the center of the patch, with numbers carved into it. 127B. "What were you burying out here, Magnus?" Silas muttered. As the sun began to set, Scout suddenly stopped barking and froze, staring toward the tree line. Silas followed his gaze and saw 3 riders, approaching slowly, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They weren't coming to welcome him to the neighborhood. The lead rider dismounted about 50 yards away and called out, "You need to leave this place, stranger." Tonight. Silas felt his hand move instinctively toward the rifle on his saddle. Scout positioned himself between his master and the approaching men, growling low in his throat. "I own this land legally," Silas replied, his voice steady despite the tension. "Legal don't mean safe," the man responded. "Some things are buried here that ought to stay buried, and some people don't take kindly to folks digging where they shouldn't." The man remounted his horse, and the three riders began to circle the property slowly, like vultures waiting for something to die. But they didn't leave, and as darkness fell, Silas realized they weren't planning to. Silas spent the night in the barn with his rifle across his lap, Scout alert beside him. The three riders maintained their distance, but never left, taking turns riding slow circles around the property. When dawn broke, they were gone, but their message was clear. He was being watched. The morning light revealed more disturbing details. Behind the house, Silas discovered a root cellar that had been recently sealed with fresh concrete. The work looked recent, maybe 6 months old, not 3 years like Magnus's disappearance. Scout began digging frantically at a spot near the well, uncovering a metal strongbox buried just below the surface. Inside, Silas found surveyor's maps that matched the pencil coordinates from his deed. Each mark corresponded to red X's across his property, and at the bottom of the map someone had written, "Total estimated value, $23,000. But there was more. A letter dated just 8 months ago, written in a woman's handwriting. "Father's work must be protected. I've sealed the main cache and scattered the evidence. If something happens to me, follow the coordinates to find the truth. ST. Had to be Sarah Thornfield, Magnus's daughter. She hadn't fled to California 3 years ago. She'd been here recently, protecting her father's discoveries. A sound made him look up. A woman was approaching on horseback, moving cautiously, but with purpose. She dismounted and strode toward him with determined steps. "You're the one who bought this cursed place," she said, her voice mixing resignation with relief. "Clementine Ross," she introduced herself. "I own the adjacent property, or what's left of it after Banks's men finished with me." She was probably 40, with the weathered look of someone who'd fought hard battles and lost most of them. But her eyes held something else, hope. "Those men who visited you last night work for Orville Banks. He's been systematically forcing landowners to sell for 3 years, ever since Magnus disappeared. Most folks gave up and moved on. The few who didn't." She gestured toward her own property, where Silas could see burned outbuildings and broken fencing. "You know what this is about, don't you?" Silas showed her the map with coordinates. Her face went pale. Magnus found the largest silver deposit in territorial history, but when he tried to file legal claims, he discovered that Banks had already bribed territorial officials to grant exclusive mining rights to a fake company. So he hid his evidence? Magnus was a geologist. He documented everything: the mineral surveys, the corruption, the forged papers. But Banks killed him before he could expose it all. What about his daughter? Sarah came back secretly after her father's funeral. She spent months hiding his evidence and sealing up anything valuable. But she disappeared 8 months ago. I assumed Banks's men got her too. Scout suddenly started barking toward the house. Through the windows, Silas could see movement. Someone was inside, searching systematically through the rooms. "They're looking for what Sarah hid," Clementine whispered. "Same thing they've been hunting for since Magnus died." Silas raised his rifle, but Clementine grabbed his arm. "There are too many of them, and they have the sheriff in their pocket. You can't fight them head on." "Then what do you suggest?" "Find Sarah's evidence before they do." According to those coordinates, she spread it across multiple locations. It's the only way to prove Banks murdered Magnus and expose the whole conspiracy. A window shattered inside the house. The searchers were getting frustrated and destructive. Scout's barking grew more frantic, but then they heard the sound that chilled Silas to the bone. Someone had started digging behind the barn, right where the concrete cellar had been sealed. They'd found Sarah's hiding place. The sound of breaking concrete echoed from behind the barn. Silas and Clementine crept around the building's edge to see 2 men with sledgehammers attacking the sealed cellar entrance. A third man stood guard, while a fourth directed the operation from horseback. "That's Orville Banks," Clementine whispered, pointing to the mounted figure. "He's the one who's been buying up all the land. Claims he represents Eastern investors, but nobody believes that." Silas recognized him, the nervous man who'd sold him the property. Banks had deliberately sold him a ranch he knew was dangerous, using Silas as an unwitting pawn in whatever scheme was unfolding. The concrete cracked and fell away in chunks. Within minutes, the men had exposed a wooden hatch leading down into darkness. One of them climbed down with a lantern while the others waited above. "Empty!" came the muffled shout from below. "Whatever was down here, it's gone!" Banks cursed loudly and dismounted. Thornfield moved it before he disappeared. "Search every inch of this property. Check the barn, the house, every outbuilding. It has to be here somewhere." Silas felt Scout tense beside him. The dog was staring intently at something in the distance. Not the men by the cellar, but toward the tree line where yesterday's riders had emerged. 3 more horsemen were approaching at a gallop, but these weren't the same men from the night before. The lead rider carried a badge on his vest, a federal marshal. As they drew closer, Banks and his men quickly abandoned their digging and tried to appear casual. The marshal didn't buy the act for a second. "Orville Banks," the marshal called out as he dismounted. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal mining regulations." Banks tried to run, but one of the other marshals cut him off. As they wrestled him to the ground, he shouted desperately toward the house. "The deed! Get the deed! It's all meaningless without the deed." The men who'd been searching the house came running out, but the marshals were ready for them. Gunshots rang out as the criminals tried to fight their way free. Scout barked furiously, but Silas held him back. When the dust settled, 2 of Banks's men lay wounded, and the rest were in custody. The head marshal approached Silas and Clementine. "Marshal Davis," he introduced himself. "We've been tracking Banks and his operation for months. He's been using fraudulent deeds and intimidation to steal mineral-rich properties across 3 territories. So the land really is mine?" Silas asked. "Depends. Do you have the original deed that Magnus Thornfield signed before he disappeared?" Silas pulled out the deed he'd received at the land office. Marshal Davis examined it carefully, then shook his head. "This is a forgery. A good one, but still fake. The real deed would have Magnus's signature and a specific seal that's missing here." Clementine and Silas exchanged glances. Without the legitimate deed, Silas had no legal claim to the property or the silver deposit underneath it. Where would the real deed be? Silas asked. If Magnus was as smart as people say, he hid it somewhere safe, somewhere only he would think to look. Scout suddenly bolted toward the house, barking excitedly. He scratched at the front door, then ran to the window, then back to the door. The dog was trying to tell them something, but as they approached the house, Marshal Davis held up his hand. "Wait, if Banks was willing to kill for whatever's hidden here, we need to assume he wasn't working alone. Someone else knew about this operation, and they're still out there." From inside the house came the sound of footsteps moving quickly across the wooden floors. Someone had been hiding inside all along, waiting for the right moment to make their move. The sound of breaking concrete echoed from behind the barn. Silas and Clementine crept around the building's edge to see 2 men with sledgehammers attacking the sealed cellar entrance. A 3rd man stood guard, while a 4th directed the operation from horseback. "That's definitely Banks," Clementine whispered, pointing to the mounted figure. "He's been searching for this cellar for months." The concrete cracked and fell away in chunks. Within minutes, the men had exposed a wooden hatch leading down into darkness. One of them climbed down with a lantern while the others waited above. "Empty!" came the muffled shout from below. "Whatever was down here, it's gone." Banks cursed loudly and dismounted. "Sarah moved it before we caught up to her. Search every inch of this property. Check the barn, the house, every outbuilding. The evidence has to be here somewhere." Silas felt Scout tense beside him. The dog was staring intently at something in the distance. Not the men by the cellar, but toward the tree line where 3 riders were approaching at a gallop. But these weren't more of Banks's men. The lead rider carried a badge on his vest, a federal marshal. As they drew closer, Banks and his men quickly abandoned their digging and tried to appear casual. The marshal wasn't fooled for a second. "Orville Banks," the marshal called out as he dismounted. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal mining regulations." Banks tried to run, but one of the other marshals cut him off. As they wrestled him to the ground, he shouted desperately toward the house. "She's here. Sarah Thornfield is here. She came back yesterday." The front door suddenly burst open, and a woman emerged with a rifle pointed directly at the marshals, but her hands were shaking, and her eyes were wild with exhaustion and fear. "Don't trust them," Sarah Thornfield shouted. "Banks has people everywhere. The sheriff, the judge, even some federal marshals are on his payroll." Marshal Davis, who was leading the arrest, slowly raised his hands. "Miss Thornfield, we're not your enemies. We've been tracking Banks's operation for months. We know about your father's murder. Prove it, Sarah demanded, though her rifle wavered. Davis carefully reached into his jacket and pulled out a telegram. This is from the federal prosecutor in Denver. We have a witness, one of Banks's men who turned evidence in exchange for immunity. He confessed to helping murder Magnus Thornfield. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't lower her weapon. I've been running for 8 months, hiding in different territories, trying to stay ahead of his men. I only came back yesterday because I heard someone had bought the property. She looked directly at Silas. I hoped whoever bought it might help me recover my father's evidence, but I was afraid it might be another one of Banks's schemes. Scout had been digging steadily during the confrontation, and now he emerged with something in his mouth, a small leather pouch covered in dirt. Sarah's face transformed when she saw it. Father's emergency cash. He trained our old dog to hide that pouch if strangers came to the property. Inside the pouch was a key and a detailed map showing where Magnus had hidden his most damaging evidence. Documentation that would expose the entire conspiracy. But as Marshal Davis examined the documents, gunshots rang out from the direction of the road. More riders were approaching, at least a dozen men, and they weren't coming to surrender. Those are Banks's backup men, Sarah said grimly. The ones who've been watching from the hills. They know we've found the evidence. The mysterious observer from the previous chapter finally revealed himself as one of the approaching riders, Banks's lieutenant, who'd been reporting every development back to his boss. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time, the criminals weren't planning to leave any witnesses alive. The first gunshots shattered the morning air as Silas dove behind the water trough, pulling Clementine with him. Marshal Davis took cover behind a support beam on the porch while Sarah crouched behind the house corner, returning fire with practiced precision. Scout had reached the old oak tree and was digging frantically, but he was completely exposed in the open ground. 3 riders broke from the circle and charged toward him, firing as they rode. I have to get to Scout, Silas shouted over the gunfire. You'll be cut down before you take 10 steps, Marshal Davis replied, reloading his weapon. But Clementine was studying the terrain with a rancher's eye. The irrigation ditch runs from here to that tree. It's deep enough for cover if you stay low. Sarah overheard and shook her head violently. Those documents aren't worth your life. My father died trying to expose these people. Your father died because he tried to fight them alone, Silas replied. We have a federal marshal and evidence that can end this. He sprinted toward the ditch as bullets whizzed overhead. The shallow channel was just deep enough to provide cover as he crawled toward Scout. The dog had found something, a metal container the size of a saddlebag, partially unearthed. The 3 riders were closing fast. Silas grabbed the container and Scout, then rolled into the deeper part of the ditch just as the horsemen thundered past, their shots kicking up dirt where he'd been seconds before. Inside the container were dozens of documents, including the original deed with Magnus Thornfield's signature and an official territorial seal. But more importantly, there were detailed records of bribes paid to territorial officials, forged mining claims, and a list of everyone involved in the conspiracy. One name at the top of the list made Silas's blood run cold. Territorial Governor Edmund Hartwell, the man responsible for approving all land and mining rights. A voice called out from the circle of riders. Enough shooting. We know you found what we're looking for. Send the woman out with the documents and the rest of you can ride away alive. Sarah emerged from cover with her hands raised, but Marshal Davis grabbed her arm. Don't do it. They'll kill us all either way. Then we make our stand here, she said grimly. But as the riders prepared for another assault, the sound of approaching horses came from the east. A lot of horses. A dust cloud on the horizon revealed at least 20 federal marshals riding hard toward the ranch. The leader of the attacking riders cursed loudly. Banks must have talked. The tide was turning. But the criminals weren't finished. Their leader dismounted and pulled out a stick of dynamite, lighting the fuse with grim determination. If we can't have those documents, nobody can. He hurled the explosive toward the house where they'd taken shelter. The fuse was burning fast and there was nowhere to run. Scout barked once and bolted toward the dynamite, but Silas realized with horror what the dog was planning to do. The loyal animal was going to try to retrieve it, just like he'd been trained to fetch objects for his master. But this time, fetching would mean certain death. Silas threw himself forward and tackled Scout before the dog could reach the burning dynamite. They rolled together into the irrigation ditch just as the explosion rocked the ground above them. Dirt and debris rained down, but the ditch had protected them from the worst of the blast. The house windows shattered, but the structure held. More importantly, The documents were safe in their metal container. The federal marshals arrived at full gallop, surrounding the remaining attackers before they could reload or escape. Within minutes, the gunfight was over. Several of the criminals lay wounded, while others threw down their weapons in surrender. Marshal Davis emerged from the smoke and debris, bleeding from a cut on his forehead but otherwise unharmed. "Is everyone alive?" Sarah ran to where Silas was checking Scout for injuries. The dog was shaken but unharmed, still clutching a corner of the leather pouch in his teeth as if afraid to let go of his treasure. The lead federal marshal, a grizzled man with captain's bars on his uniform, approached them with one of the captured attackers. "This one's been talking. Says he has information about territorial corruption that goes all the way to the governor's office." Silas handed over the metal container. "You'll find everything you need in here." As the captain examined the documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Names, dates, amounts. This is enough to bring down half the territorial government. Where did Magnus Thornfield get all this information?" "My father was a careful man," Sarah explained. "When he discovered the silver deposit, he also uncovered the corruption that was trying to steal it. He documented every bribe, every forged document, every illegal claim." The captain looked up from the papers. "According to this, Governor Hartwell received over $50,000 to grant exclusive mining rights to a shell company controlled by Eastern investors, the same company that's been using violence to force landowners to sell." One of the captured men spoke up desperately. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This conspiracy reaches beyond the territory. There are people in Washington who will do anything to keep this quiet." "Then they're going to be disappointed," the captain replied. "These documents are going straight to the federal prosecutor's office in Denver." But even as the marshals secured the prisoners and evidence, Silas noticed something troubling. The mysterious observer who'd been watching them, Banks's lieutenant, had escaped during the final assault. Sarah saw his concern and nodded grimly. That was Marcus Webb, Banks's right-hand man. "He'll report back to the Eastern investors who funded this whole operation. My father's evidence might stop the local corruption, but the people behind it won't give up easily." The captain overheard and approached them. "Don't worry about Webb. We have federal agents tracking the money trail back to its source. This evidence you've provided gives us everything we need to expose the entire conspiracy." But as if to prove that danger still lurked, one of the wounded prisoners called out weakly, "You think this is over? The Eastern Mining Consortium has connections in Washington. They'll find another way to get this land." "Not anymore," the captain replied firmly, holding up Magnus's documents. "These records show federal crimes that can't be covered up or bought off. The Attorney General himself will be prosecuting this case." Still, Scout remained alert, his instincts telling him that while the immediate threat was over, complete safety hadn't yet arrived. The war for the silver deposit was nearly won, but one final confrontation remained. 3 weeks later, Silas stood in the Denver federal courthouse as the judge read the verdict. Governor Edmund Hartwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for corruption and conspiracy. Orville Banks received 15 years for fraud and inciting violence. Dozens of territorial officials faced similar fates, but the victory felt incomplete. Marcus Webb, Banks's escaped lieutenant, had been spotted twice in the past week watching the property from distant hills. The federal marshals were actively hunting him, but he remained dangerous and free. Sarah joined him on the courthouse steps. "The federal prosecutor says the Eastern investors behind the conspiracy have been identified, but they're protected by powerful friends in Washington. It could take years to bring them to justice." "Years we might not have," Silas replied grimly. Back at the ranch, Scout had grown increasingly agitated. The dog refused to stray far from the house and barked at every unfamiliar sound. Even with federal marshals patrolling the valley, danger felt imminent. Clementine arrived that evening with disturbing news. 3 more ranchers south of here have been approached by men offering to buy their land. The offers were generous, too generous to refuse safely. "They're still trying to control the silver deposit," Silas realized. "If they can't get my property directly, they'll surround it and make my life impossible." That night, Scout's barking woke Silas from uneasy sleep. Through the window, he saw torches moving across his pasture land, at least a dozen men on foot, spreading what looked like coal oil on the grass. They were going to burn him out. Silas grabbed his rifle and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. "Federal marshals are on their way," he shouted, though he had no way to contact them quickly. The torchbearers hesitated, then began retreating toward the tree line. But one of them called out in a voice that carried clearly across the valley. "This is your last warning, Ward. Sell the land, or lose everything you care about." As the arsonists melted into the darkness, Silas realized they weren't just threatening his property. Scout whined and pressed against his leg, sensing his master's fear. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed woman arrived in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 armed guards. She introduced herself as Victoria Ashford, representative of the Eastern Mining Consortium. "Mr. Ward," she said with practiced courtesy, "my employers are prepared to offer you $100,000 for your property. That's nearly 20 times what you paid for it. And if I refuse?" Her smile never wavered, but her eyes grew cold. "Then you'll discover that there are many ways to make a man's life difficult. Accidents happen to stubborn people, especially to their loved ones." She glanced meaningfully at Scout, and Silas felt his blood turn to ice. "You have 24 hours to decide," she continued. "Tomorrow at sunset, you'll either be a very wealthy man, or you'll face the consequences of your poor judgment." As her carriage disappeared down the valley road, Silas knew the final confrontation was coming. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting for silver or land. He'd be fighting for survival itself. The next evening, as promised, Victoria Ashford returned with her carriage and guards. But she wasn't prepared for what awaited her. Silas stood on his porch with Sarah, Clementine, and Marshall Davis, who had arrived that morning with a federal warrant. More importantly, hidden in the barn and around the property were 12 additional federal marshals, positioned and ready. "Mr. Ward," Victoria called out confidently, "I trust you've made the sensible decision." "I have," Silas replied, "but not the one you expected." Scout emerged from the house carrying a leather satchel in his mouth, the same type of pouch that had led them to Magnus's evidence. Inside were detailed photographs and documents that Sarah had been secretly gathering for weeks. "Evidence of your threats, your arsonists, and your conspiracy to circumvent federal justice," Silas announced, "including recordings of yesterday's conversation where you threatened my life." Victoria's composure cracked. "You're bluffing. You have no proof of anything." Marshall Davis stepped forward with the federal warrant. "Victoria Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and threatening a federal witness." Her guards reached for their weapons, but they were immediately surrounded by marshals emerging from concealment. The fight was over before it began. As Victoria was led away in shackles, she spat venomously. "This won't end here. There are others who will finish what we started." "No," Sarah said firmly, "there won't be." She held up a thick folder of documents. "While you were focused on threatening Silas, I was visiting every territory office, every federal building, and every newspaper between here and Denver. Your entire organization has been exposed. The Attorney General in Washington has launched a full investigation based on the evidence we provided." 3 months later, Silas stood in the same valley, but everything had changed. The silver deposit had been developed into a legitimate mining operation under federal oversight, with profits shared between the government and local landowners. Clementine had received compensation for her family's losses and was rebuilding her ranch. Sarah had used her portion of the mining proceeds to establish a school for the valley's children, naming it after her father. Scout had earned a permanent place in local legend as the dog who helped expose territorial corruption. He spent his days patrolling the valley, no longer searching for buried secrets, but simply enjoying the peace that had finally come to the land. Silas remained on his property, now worth exactly what Victoria Ashford had offered, $100,000. But he'd earned it honestly without blood or corruption. The Eastern Mining Consortium had been dissolved, its leaders facing federal prosecution. Marcus Webb, Banks's escaped lieutenant, had been captured in Denver while trying to flee to Mexico. The territorial government had been reformed with new, honest officials. And the valley that had once been terrorized by greed and violence was now home to thriving families and legitimate businesses. As Silas watched the sunset from his porch, Scout beside him, he reflected on Magnus Thornfield's sacrifice. The man had died protecting this land, but his legacy lived on. Justice had prevailed, the corrupt had been punished, and the valley was finally free. The secret of the $23 million silver deposit was no longer a secret. It was a foundation for an honest future, built on the courage of those who refused to let evil triumph. And sometimes, that was worth more than all the silver in the ground. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where honor and determination clash with danger in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.